Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something deeply relatable. We're going to talk about being bored. Yes, that same dull, listless feeling you get while staring at your phone, scrolling through social media, waiting for something remotely interesting to appear. But unlike you, the poor people of ancient times didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't have cat videos, and certainly didn't have Netflix. They had rocks, and occasionally goats. So, how exactly did they cope? Now, before you get cozy under the blankets and start thinking that life in the ancient world must have been some non-stop struggle for survival, let me tell you something fun. Survival took a lot of effort, but not all the effort. Even hunter-gatherers had downtime, and humans, being the restless little creatures that we are, will always find ways to waste time. Boredom is practically part of our DNA. So tonight, we're going to float slowly through the ancient world, poking around the lives of Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and a few other random societies, just to see how they distracted themselves from sheer existential nothingness. Spoiler: it usually involved gambling, making fun of politicians, or doodling very inappropriate graffiti on sacred monuments, because of course it did. Let's start simple. Imagine you're in ancient Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. You'd think inventing writing, cities, and beer would keep people pretty occupied. But no, even the Babylonians got bored. What did they do? They invented board games. Literally, the royal game of yore, dating back about 4,600 years, is basically humanity's earliest documented attempt at saying, okay, I've had enough of staring at sheep. Let's play a game. The board looks kind of like backgammon's weird cousin. You had little dice, carved markers, and the goal was to race your pieces across the board before your opponent did. Was there money on the line? Oh, absolutely. Humans didn't invent games just for fun. They invented them for gambling. That little thrill of risk was the same in 2600 BCE as it is in Las Vegas today. Of course, some people got so addicted that ancient kings had to put laws in place about gambling debts. Imagine your husband losing the family goat because he just had to get that last roll of the dice. Very relatable. Now, if we drift down to ancient Egypt, things get even more sleepy. Egyptians had a game called Cenote, which looks like a minimalist board of little squares. The rules aren't totally clear, but it was definitely popular. Pharaohs were buried with Senate boards in their tombs, so apparently they planned to keep being bored in the afterlife too. Senate was also one of those games that started fun but ended up deeply spiritual. Over time, people decided it wasn't just a game. It was a metaphor for moving through life, dodging bad luck, and hoping for divine favor. In other words, Candyland, but with cosmic stakes. And like most spiritual things, it was probably a good excuse to pass long evenings when the Nile wasn't flooding. Egyptians also loved music, dancing, and throwing parties. Drinking beer, their national pastime, helped. Nothing kills boredom quite like slightly fermented barley water and someone banging a tambourine badly. And then, when they weren't gaming or drinking, Egyptians amused themselves by writing what we might call the first memes. They loved graffiti. On temples, on statues, on tomb walls. You'd see doodles of animals, silly little sketches of people falling over, even jokes about how fat one particular priest was. Because, yes, apparently roasting the local clergy was just as funny in 1500 BCE as it is today. Now, let's gently float over to ancient Greece, the land of philosophers and toga parties. You'd think the birthplace of democracy and tragedy wouldn't have time for nonsense. But if you've ever seen a drunk Greek vase painting, yeah, they had time. Bored Greek men often hung out in the symposium, basically a wine party, with more talking and slightly less dancing. They'd recline on couches, get tipsy, and play drinking games like kotobos, which was literally flinging the dregs of your wine at a target. Imagine beer pong, but with red wine and slightly more existential philosophy happening in the background. Meanwhile, Greek children had dolls, little carts, and knucklebones, basically early dice. And the Greeks also left behind graffiti. My personal favorite example is from the island of Thera. Someone literally scratched "so-and-so is handsome" into the wall, which is basically the ancient equivalent of carving "Brad was here" into a desk. Humans haven't changed. Oh, and Greek theater, that was prime boredom killer. People went not just to see deep tragedies about fate and the gods, but also slapstick comedies, where actors wore oversized costumes and made jokes about politicians. So yes, ancient Greece invented live-action Saturday Night Live. The Romans, of course, took boredom management to another level. Because if there's one thing Romans loved, it was excess. You've probably heard of the Colosseum, where gladiators fought. Wild animals were released, and everyone collectively pretended this was entertainment. But here's the thing, not all Romans had front row seats, and not all games were about blood. Many Romans spent their downtime gambling with dice, playing a game called ludus latruncularum, a kind of Roman chess. They also scratched game boards right into the stone steps of public buildings, which is the ancient version of playing Candy Crush on your work computer. And the graffiti. Oh, the graffiti. Pompeii's walls were basically a Reddit forum carved into stone. We have complaints about landlords, political endorsements, random insults like Celadus, the Thracian gladiator, is the delight of all the girls. Imagine your crush writing that on a wall and the whole city seeing it. Embarrassing. Romans also loved telling jokes. The oldest surviving joke book, the Philagelos, is basically a dad joke collection from the 4th century. The humor hasn't aged well, but some of it still hits. For example, a barber, a bald man, and an absent-minded professor walk into a bar. Okay, not exactly, but it does include one about a man who buys a slave, realizes the slave has died, and complains. The seller replies, "He didn't die when I owned him." That's the level of humor, flat, weirdly relatable, and perfect for passing time. Now, let's pause for a moment here. Because if you're picturing ancient people as constantly running from lions or hammering rocks into tools, you might be surprised at just how much chill time they had. Boredom is a universal human problem, and from what we can tell, their solutions weren't so different from ours. Games, gambling, drinking, roasting politicians, writing dumb jokes on walls, watching other humans make fools of themselves. Sound familiar? Yeah, we basically still do the same things, just with electricity. Let's float to another corner of the world, because, yes, boredom wasn't just a Mediterranean problem. In ancient China, people had games like Liubo, and early versions of Go-Go, by the way, is still around, which makes it the ultimate anti-boredom tool. People have been staring at those black and white stones for 2,500 years. The Chinese elite also enjoyed poetry contests. Imagine sitting in a beautiful garden, sipping wine, and your friend challenges you to improvise a haiku. Sounds classy, until you remember that if you lost, you probably had to drink more wine. which was the whole point. Meanwhile, in India, people came up with chess, or at least its ancestor chaturanga. It started as a war simulation and ended up as another way for nobles to spend a whole afternoon pretending to be strategic geniuses while really just killing time. So, how did ancient people deal with boredom? They did exactly what we do. They killed time. They made games. They doodled. They mocked their leaders. They drank. And occasionally, they invented something lasting, like chess, theater, or that timeless classic, the dirty joke. And if you're feeling the weight of history pressing down on you tonight, don't worry. Somewhere 3,000 years ago, a bored teenager was scratching graffiti into a temple wall, writing the equivalent of "I was here." So, we've already wandered through Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and a few other corners of the ancient world. And what did we learn? That people got bored, invented games, doodled rude things on walls, and occasionally gambled away their goats. But boredom, like taxes and inbreeding among royals, didn't stop with antiquity. As we drift along into the Middle Ages, we find an entirely new set of ways people tried to cure their restlessness. Some of them are charming, some are very strange, and some are so pointless that they make you feel better about spending 3 hours scrolling TikTok. Let's start with medieval peasants. These are the folks who get painted as constantly working, trudging through fields, and dying at the age of 30 from plague. Which, to be fair, was sometimes true. But even peasants had evenings and holy days off. And what did they do with them? They played games. Medieval village life included ball games, rough, chaotic versions of soccer, where the ball could be inflated pig bladders. And the goal was basically don't die before sundown. The rules varied wildly, but one general principle was anything goes. Tackling, shoving, occasionally maiming your neighbor. The church hated it, which usually meant everyone loved it. When they weren't chasing pig bladders, peasants amused themselves with dice. Gambling was as addictive in 1300 as it was in Babylon. So addictive that kings kept passing laws to ban dice games, especially for soldiers. Because apparently, nothing says please desert the army like losing your pay in a tavern game at midnight. Meanwhile, medieval children had toys. Yes, actual toys. Archaeologists have found little carved horses, dolls, and even spinning tops. So the idea that medieval kids just sat around milking cows all day isn't entirely true. They played, and when they got bored, they invented new games, many of which look suspiciously like tag, hide and seek, and hopscotch. Humanity hasn't exactly evolved. Now, if we float up a few rungs on the social ladder, nobles had their own unique boredom cures. Falconry, for instance, because nothing screams I have too much time and money like training a bird of prey to go fetch rabbits for you. Nobles also loved tournaments. Jousting wasn't just about glory, it was about killing time in the most unnecessarily dangerous way possible. Royal courts, though, had subtler amusements. Chess spread widely in medieval Europe, becoming the intellectual way to look busy while actually avoiding real responsibilities. If you picture some pale, gout-ridden king sitting at a board for 6 hours, while courtiers pretend to care about his brilliant knight move, yes, that happened. And then there was courtly love. Noblemen and ladies invented entire rituals of romantic poetry, songs, and sighing dramatically at each other, all while very pointedly not doing anything about it. Basically, medieval fan fiction. Now, monks. Let's talk about monks. You might think a monastery was the most boring place on earth. And in some ways, yes, hours of prayer, silence, copying manuscripts by candlelight. But monks also got creative. When they got restless, they doodled in the margins of manuscripts. Some of these doodles are priceless: bunnies fighting knights, snails battling soldiers, weird little faces sticking out of letters. Basically, the medieval version of drawing memes in the back of your math notebook. One monk even drew a cat peeing in the corner of a holy text, which tells you everything you need to know about how thrilling monastic life really was. Of course, medieval cities had their own forms of entertainment. Street performers, jugglers, and musicians were common. People loved festivals, markets, and carnivals, anything loud, chaotic, and slightly sinful. For the upper crust, there were masked balls, elaborate feasts, and yes, more gambling. Always gambling. And for those with a darker sense of humor, public executions were treated as entertainment. Crowds gathered, vendors sold food, and people treated it like a festival. Morbid, yes, but also, in their minds, a perfectly valid way to cure boredom on a slow Tuesday. Now, let's drift eastward again. In medieval Japan, samurai and nobles had their own unique pastimes. Poetry competitions were hugely popular. Imagine a warrior who spent his day practicing with a sword, then came home and nervously wrote a haiku about cherry blossoms. They also had board games like Go and Shugoroku, a dice game that sometimes doubled as gambling, because apparently dice addiction is a global human trait. And when they weren't playing games, Japanese elites hosted tea ceremonies, which sounds relaxing until you realize the entire ritual was about endlessly debating the proper way to pour hot water. Basically, the medieval Japanese version of arguing about coffee brewing methods on Reddit. Meanwhile, in the Islamic Golden Age, scholars and elites entertained themselves with puzzles, chess, and storytelling. The 1001 Nights, yes, the famous book, is basically a giant collection of boredom killers. Short tales, funny anecdotes, bits of wisdom, and scandalous stories passed around to pass long evenings. Think of it as the Netflix binge of the Abbasid Caliphate. And then, of course, there's laughter. Humans have always cured boredom with jokes, pranks, and satire. In medieval Europe, fools and jesters were basically the live-action meme accounts of their day. Their job was literally to make nobles laugh by doing ridiculous things, telling jokes, and occasionally mocking the king to his face, which was risky, but apparently worth it for job security. So, what does all this tell us? That whether you were a poor peasant with a pig bladder or a noble with a falcon, the fight against boredom was universal. People invented games, competitions, festivals, doodles, poetry, and the occasional prank just to make the endless hours pass. And the best part? Many of these things survived. Chess, playing cards, dice, even playground games like tag. You're basically carrying on a tradition of people who, thousands of years ago, were just as restless and silly as you are. Let's pause here, sink into the blankets a little deeper, and get ready to drift further, because in the next stretch, we'll float into the Renaissance and beyond. We'll look at how boredom shaped new inventions, strange royal hobbies, and even some of the world's earliest viral trends. Because history, at its core, is really just one long story of humans trying not to be bored.